event is presented in collaboration with the IIT College of Architecture, the Farnsworth House, and the Poetry Foundation, and other partners. Later, Professor Sabatino will explain how this project of a tribute to Edith Farnsworth was conceived, how, which are the partners of this project, and how the project will be further developed. A few words on how tonight's program will be carried out. We will begin with a poetry reading in Italian and in English from Provisional Conclusions, a selection of the poetry of Eugenio Montale, translated by Edith Farnsworth. We will so give voice to Eugenio Montale, Italian poet, prose writer, editor and translator, and recipient of the 1975 Nobel Prize for Literature. He is considered one of the greatest Italian lyric poets. Dr. Silvia Lorenzini, one of the instructors of our Italian language school, Italcultura, will read the verses by Montale in Italian with her beautiful, pure Tuscan accent. And while Larry Gardner, former professor in political science with DePaul University, translator from Italian and actor, will read with his professional actor's voice in English the verses translated by Farnsworth, so in her translation. Afterwards, Professor Sabatino will introduce Alex Beam, journalist of the Boston Globe and author of a forthcoming biography of Edith Farnsworth. And there will be a Q&A session after Alex Beam's talk, and we'll conclude the evening with the second part of the poetry reading. So before inviting Silvia and Larry to start the reading, I would like to thank all the partners of this project. Professor Sabatino will mention all of them after me, afterwards. And of course, I would like to thank all of you for being here. Enjoy the evening. Thank you. And Silvia Lorenzini.
I'm going to give a little clue to the poem before I read the poem itself, and also explain any words that would not be normally understood, even though they're in English. On seeing and hearing things in the moonlight. Another moon effect. The texture of the Carib silhouetted, nude against the drowsy azure. The ring of voices and silver fingers passing by the door's embrasure. The feather snared. The tramping feet upon the vanishing jetty. And the felucca luffs, her sails slack, and comes about on a new tack. Carib referred to the carob tree, embrasure was the door's threshold, and felucca luffs means that the sailboat turned towards the wind.
Altro effetto di luna. La trama del carrubo che si profila nuda contro l'azzurro sonnolento, il suono delle voci, la trafila delle dita d'argento sulle soglie, la piuma che si invischia, un trepestio sul molo che si scioglie, e la feluca già ripiega il volo con le vele dimesse come spoglie.
On finding one's way in the world through poetry, we never know. We never know what we shall unearth tomorrow, whether dark or gay. Perhaps our way to untouched glades will take us where the waters murmur of eternal youth. Or it may be a long descent into the last of vales in darkness with the lost memory of the day. Strange lands may still accord us welcome. We shall mislay our recollections of the sun, and falling out of mind will be the tingling of rhymes. Oh, the fable which explains our life will change, how suddenly, into the dark tale which is not told. But one thing still you have entrusted, Father, that a little of your gift will always pass in syllables which we bring with us, bumbling bees. We shall go far and always keep an echo of your voice, as the tarnished grass recalls the sun in the darkened courts among the buildings. And then, one day, these soundless syllables that we derived from you and fed with weariness and silences, to some fraternal heart will seem well seasoned with the salt of Greece.
Noi non sappiamo quale sortiremo domani, oscuro o lieto. Forse il nostro cammino a non tocche radure ci addurrà, dove mormori eterna l'acqua di giovinezza. O sarà forse un discendere fino al vallo estremo, nel buio, perso il ricordo del mattino. Ancora terre straniere forse ci accoglieranno, smarriremo la memoria del sole, dalla mente ci cadrà il tintinnare delle rime. Oh, la favola, onde s'esprime la nostra vita, repente si cangerà nella cupa storia che non si racconta. Pur di una cosa ci affidi, Padre, e questa è: che un poco del tuo dono sia passato per sempre nelle sillabe che rechiamo con noi, api ronzanti. Lontani andremo e serberemo un eco della tua voce, come si ricorda del sole l'erba grigia nelle corti scurite, tra le case. E un giorno queste parole senza rumore che teco educammo, nutrite di stanchezze e di silenzi, parranno a un fraterno cuore sapide di sale greco.
The hoopoe is a Euro-Asian bird with a distinctive crown, crest of beautiful feathers. And this is something of an ode to a majestic bird, evoking awe of the miraculous. Hoopoe. Hoopoe, fowl of comedy, slandered by the poets, you twirl your crest from the high pole on the chicken coop, and like a fake weathercock, whirl in the wind. Ambassador of spring, hoopoe, since time for you stands still, and February will die no more, since everything outside of you pays homage to the motions of your head, and you, madcap, vouchsafe no heed, but turn about instead.
Upupa, upupa, ilare uccello calunniato dai poeti, che roti la tua cresta sopra l'aereo stollo del pollaio e come un finto gallo giri al vento, nunzio primaverile, upupa, come per te il tempo s'arresta, non muore più il febbraio, come tutto di fuori si protende al muover del tuo capo, aligero folletto, e tu lo ignori.
thank you. This was wonderful to hear. I was thinking, as architects, we're always so image-driven, and these words were evocative. You could just see these creatures. And well, thank you, Alberta, and we're very pleased to be here tonight. And as you can see from this gaggle of logos, this is a very interdisciplinary evening. We collaborated with the Poetry Foundation, the Italian Institute, the Newberry, the Farnsworth, and the Mies Society. And I think it's a very important sort of initiative because, of course, when folks speak about Edith Farnsworth, they always talk about her as a patron, and of course the inevitable discussions with Mies and all the interaction and also the issues that led to her lawsuit against Mies. So we thought she, in addition to being a great patron, deserves to be sort of profiled in a more interesting way, and what other more interesting way to bring her work as a poet and a translator. Before I jump to a very brief PowerPoint presentation to introduce you a little bit to Edith, I don't want to steal, of course, Alex Beam's thunder, so I will keep it to just some images for those who aren't familiar with the Farnsworth. I would like to let you know, though, for your calendars, that we have a Tuesday, May 19th, second iteration. This is like a roving event. We will be working at the Poetry Foundation on the May 14th with Nora Wendell. She's a translator, and she speaks, well, she's an architect, educator, an author of an upcoming bio on Edith Farnsworth, but she will speak to Edith Farnsworth as translator. And then the third and last part will be held at the Newberry, where of course that's where the Farnsworth archives are held, and that will be September the 10th by yours truly. So, I'm sorry, I should have said, for those of you who don't recognize this image, it's the Farnsworth. It's by a German photographer, Alina Danik, who's going to be exhibiting in Crown Hall next fall, and also hopefully at the Farnsworth. And to the left is a view out of her villa at Bagno Ripoli. This is some of the material we found digging through the archives at the Newberry of Edith as a young woman and as a child. And this, of course, was one of the photos of Montale that she sort of kept in her archives, obviously with great sentimental value. This is a kind of beautiful moment where you can see her annotations from darling, she annotated to dear. So it's a very beautiful kind of process, a careful one that is unveiled rather through her archival. And this, of course, is the house that brought her fame and for some infamy. You know, of course, all the architects were appalled that she would sort of challenge the work of the master. This is a beautiful photo of Mies casually lighting his cigar on the steps of the Farnsworth Hedrick Blessing, and this is John Miller's photo of the great black maple, right? Scott, correct me if it's a good color. This is the interior, for those of you who haven't been to the Farnsworth, as reinstalled by Peter Colombo, Lord Colombo. But this is perhaps the more interesting by Gorman Child, a photographer of Plano, that showed the ways that Edith inhabited the space throughout her life. And this is her here in the foreground, hanging out with her dog and picking flowers in the field. So this is just to, I'm not going to talk architecture, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background for those who aren't familiar with the Farnsworth House, that it's well worth a visit. This is interesting, also Hedrick Blessing photos. Hedrick Blessing was the gold standard of architectural photography here in the city. Their archives are held at the Chicago History Museum. This is the original interior as well, at least when it was completed. So the sort of passage to Lord Colombo's interiors was much more of a kind of embrace of a, at least in furniture, of a Miesian aesthetic. And with that, I'm going to leave you with Alex, who is a distinguished writer and an author journalist, who has worked as a columnist for the Boston Globe since 1990. Now, I asked him, why did you decide to write about Edith Farnsworth? And he said, well, he was intrigued by the work of various other sort of authors that had spoken about architecture and people involved with architecture from a non-specialist point of view. And so we're happy for him to have worked on this. And he will speak to us about his Edith Farnsworth in Italy, final chapter of a biography that's being published when, Alex? Soon?
2020, January, February 2020, not soon.
Well, and so I'll just show you these two images, and you can see again the villa that Edith purchased shortly after selling her Farnsworth house in Plano and leaving for the land of the poets and the lemon trees, as Goethe said. Okay, no, thank you, and I'll just leave this as an image, so as Alex speaks, you'll be brought to Italy. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Hi. This isn't in any way jarring, just give me some feedback. I took this picture, I'm happy to say. This is in Bagno Ripoli, a small town outside of Florence. Fast forwarding to the end of my talk, this is where Edith Farnsworth ended her life. She died here in 1977. I'll put this building and her 10 years in Italy in some context. Can everybody hear okay back there? Great, thank you. Alberta, thank you for having me. Michelangelo, thank you for inviting me. I also want to thank Scott Mahaffey of the Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois. I hope you all have visited, and if not, I hope you'll visit soon. Scott is really partly responsible for a delicate archaeology of Edith Farnsworth's biography that's ongoing. There's maybe 3 or 4 of us who are deeply interested in her story, including her living relatives, myself, a couple of other people. I'm going to take half a second to tell you a little bit about Dr. Edith Farnsworth before I take you to Italy in 1968, 1969. I'll explain to you in context her love for Italian culture. Edith Farnsworth, is a daughter of Chicago, grew up on the near north side, went to Latin school. I'm not sure if I think it might still be but it was on Division Street at a different location. She went to something called the American Conservatory of Music, which used to be in Chicago, no longer is. She was a talented violinist, and she got a degree at one point from the University of Chicago in its heyday. I don't want it to go unmentioned that the middle of her life was devoted to medicine. She was in the Northwestern University Medical School class of 1935, and she had a relatively distinguished career in a field that had not yet even been named when she entered it. She was referred to as a kidney researcher, and a few years later the field was named nephrology, which is of course the study of the function of the kidney. And I'm not going to go into that, but this was a woman of many parts. Violin virtuoso, a medical researcher, and, to finally get to the point, not only a published poet herself, but a woman with a deep interest in translating Italian poetry, and I think a woman who deserves, if not all, then a large portion of the credit of introducing the work of Montale, the best-known poet of his generation, into America before he received the Nobel Prize in 1975. So right now I'm going to essentially read from the final chapter of my book, which is really about Edith in Italy. And before I do that, I'm going to read a kind of brief but salacious excerpt from Edith's unpublished memoir, diary, manuscript. I hope someone is here from the Newberry. The Newberry has her notebooks in which she tried to write an account of her life. She was in this villa trying to write that memoir that never got published and never even fully came to fruition. But her first contact with Italy was when she sailed on the Julius Caesar, the ocean liner, at age 19 to study violin in Rome with the maestro Mario Corti at the Villa d'Este, a magnificent mansion in the Tivoli Gardens of Rome. Corti was a famous Italian concert virtuoso, 21 years older than Edith, who later became, this is Corti, later became artistic director of Rome's Philharmonic Academy and superintendent of La Fenice, the opera house in Venice. Anyway, this is an excerpt from Edith's memoirs. At the end of the summer program, she wrote, quote, "Corti took a furnished room for me in the apartment above the one he occupied by himself and urged her to stay in Italy as his student. She did stay, apparently as Corti's mistress. In her memoirs, she recorded the maestro's Declarazione di Amore, I love you with all my heart, and let slip that she remained in Italy for almost 2 more years. That was her first contact, if you will, with Italian culture. Now I'm going to go to Italy. I'm just going to briefly explain so that what I read has some context. Michelangelo briefly mentioned the name of Lord Peter Palumbo, architectural, important figure. He's actually still on the Pritzker Committee, I think, an important figure in the world of architecture. He bought the Mies van der Rohe house from Edith in the late 1960s, as Edith basically was getting sick of, her medical career was winding down here. She was getting sick of the Plano house. And she was already traveling to Italy. She had already met Montale. And some of what I'm going to read you takes place in an interstitial period when she's already been to Florence. She's house hunting, but for reasons of currency transfers, Palumbo, who's a British citizen, hasn't been able actually to pay her the money for the Plano house. So I'm now taking up from my soon-to-be-published book. Edith's next career, meaning after medicine, would not be as a poet, but as a translator of poetry, which she began working on as she wound down her hospital commitments. Between 68 and 71, several events occurred more or less simultaneously. She sells the house. It goes through, she had decided to move to Italy, where she had already lived for 2 years while studying violin with Corti in Rome. She had begun house hunting near Florence and had fallen in with a top-drawer literary crowd, including the future Nobel Prize winner, the poet, journalist, and critic Eugenio Montale, the poets Salvatore Quasimodo, the poet Salvatore Quasimodo, and Albino Piero, their friends, the writer Antonio Pizzuto, and the philologist Gianfranco Contini. These are all people who have sort of memories of Edith. And his wife Margaret. Elena Croce, the daughter of philosopher Benedetto Croce, had written to Montale, suggesting he meet this, quote, very intelligent woman. And Elena says, this is saying a lot, not something you find every day, and who, quote, speaks and writes in excellent New England English, and her traditions fascinated me. Attracted by Italy, according to the Italian critic Giorgio Delia, these are his words, chasing the myth, very dear to the Anglo-American culture of Florence, perennial cradle of the Renaissance, Farnsworth settled there in the hope, perhaps in the illusion, of constituting or becoming part of a cenacle, a cenacolo of writers and intellectuals. In a way, she does achieve this dream. Going on. By the time Edith caught up with the 72-year-old Montale, he was a famous poet entering his twilight years. Contemporary translator Jonathan Galassi called the older Montale, quote, a dry, wry, witty, often acerbic epigrammist whose later work was, quote, largely an ironic commentary on what came before, the retro bottega, or the back of the shop, as he called it. Montale had already begun collecting honorary degrees in Europe, and he had a presidential appointment as an Italian senator for life, and he had stopped working as a critic and editor at the Corriere della Sera. Shuttling between her old home in Plano and what was to become her new home, Edith Farnsworth started translating Montale's poetry and was clearly quite smitten by the gentlemanly poet and scholar. Montale had been director of Florence's famous Giammatteo Library before World War II, etc. Before she leaves Chicago, Farnsworth basically seals a publication deal with Henry Regnery, who ran a then famous press in Chicago. The press is still famous. It's now in New York City. Excuse me, it's now in Washington, D.C. It's something else. Several of Edith's Plano friends recalled her tapping away at Montale translations on her green Olivetti, and they likewise remembered her obvious infatuation with him. Quote, I think she was hoping that she and Montale would become an item, Evelyn Kivitz, one of her neighbors, remembered. Parky Emmons, a friend of hers from the North Side, recalled Edith stopping over to her house one day to sip vermouth and chat about Montale. Emmons said Edith showed her a Montale poem about a house on a river and claimed that he had written it for her. Quote, he's in love with me, can't you see that? Edith insisted, quote, I couldn't see it at all, Emmons later commented. Montale himself blew hot and cold on Edith Farnsworth, who was instrumental in introducing his work to American audiences. Writing to the philologist Contini, Montale complained that, quote, Farnsworth is too remote and rants too much. With much derision, she thinks she's a great violinist. But in several letters to her directly, Montale expressed different emotions. Quote, I always think of you with great affection and nostalgia for Via Carota and its dogs and Mugadi's hands. Or, quote, I just want to tell you that in capitals, I care very deeply for you and that I'm so grateful that you exist and continue to live. Not for the first time, Edith had feelings for an accomplished, worldly European man. The people who have read my book are aware that she had a kind of fascinating intellectual and deep relationship with Mies van der Rohe that's been widely documented. Perhaps you're wondering about the adorable Montale Edith wrote to her sister Marion in 1970. The days working with him were absolutely lovely, and we continue to exchange poems. Imagine meeting your soulmate at my age. Montale did write a poem for her, Alantella, the name of the neighborhood in Bagno a Ripoli, where Edith finally settled down. Published under the title In un giardino italiano, the aging Montale compared himself to a three-legged turtle struggling to navigate the hedges and undergrowth of the garden. There were a bunch of turtles, including a three-legged turtle at this villa. A quote from Montale, the old turtle walks badly, it pitches because its back foot has been cut off. In her only surviving letter to Montale, Edith mentions, quote, the turtle who's already awake, he came to me the other day on the path, his head was out, his three reptile feet carrying him along at surprising speed. In April of 1970, Edith left Chicago for good. Quote, I finally boarded the Alitalia jet, she wrote to her sister Marion, with little Miss Amy, you actually saw a picture of that dog earlier, sitting as good as gold in her traveling container. A smooth crossing with Amy sitting beside me. We landed in Rome in broad sunlight. Although she hadn't yet found a place to live, Edith had shipped a car and a container load of artworks, some furniture and personal da-da-da-da-da. In this April, da-da-da-da, there, not important. In her next letter to Marion, quote, I get the impression that a quite substantial part of the letters I read never gets, and she was very suspicious of the Italian postal system, I apologize for saying that. Yeah. In any case, the Plano property's been sold. I'm buying a most beautiful and ancient Casa Colonica up in the hills about 7 kilometers from the center of Florence, this house. She's going to live there alone. And here, let me assure you, there's no question of letting nature in. And this is code because, as Michelangelo explained to you when you come to his lecture several months from now, one of Mies van der Rohe's famous quotes about the Farnsworth House in Plano when he first saw the site of the house. He says, well, we need to build a house that will let the nature in. You're going to hear several kind of coded digs at Mies van der Rohe in Edith's writing. Anyway, she's writing to her sister, let me assure you, there's no question of letting nature in. Nature's definitely outside in the form, not in a glass house, as you can see, the very opposite. In the form of a beautiful view, a large sloping Italian garden, a patron and 2 boschetti, 2 groves, plus a number of acres of olives and vines. The seller of this house was a prominent Venetian criminal lawyer who seemed anxious to unload the massive villa, 2 stories surrounding a courtyard with a 3-story watchtower, of course, looming over the Tuscan hilltop. Not only did he settle all the difficulties so that I can have it for a price well under that for which I'm getting for the Plano property, but he's leaving me a great deal of furniture. Dozens of sofas, beds, chairs, a few massive sacristy pieces. There's the chapel, of course. The dining room furniture, all the curtains, and a flock of lamps. I went up to the villa the other day while he was on a brief visit to Firenze, and we went over the furniture situation. This is her dialoguing with the criminal lawyer. Quote, do you like that chest? Do you want that table? Shall I leave the beds? To which I could only say, dearest, don't take them all away. I need so many, but a few would help. She's living alone. In any case, Edith was clearly ecstatic in her new home, which would be furnished a long way from Barcelona pavilion chic. Sort of a reference to the Barcelona furniture you saw earlier inside the house in Plano. Quote, any ideas of decorating I had acquired had been changed, she wrote to her sister Marion. New furniture, for you familiar with Italian furniture, red satin sofas, Venetian Baroque figures with gilded skirts holding up lamps, etc., etc., etc. I wanted to mention, by the way, that Edith was a fairly significant donor to the Art Institute of Chicago, and a number of her pieces of her collection. Actually, she's a collector of Chinese sculpture. And if you go to the Art Institute website or even inside the Art Institute itself, you'll find traces of her collecting eye. With ample space, Edith entertained a steady stream of visitors, among them Italian literati, old pals from Chicago, and also Lord Peter Palumbo, who tended to be in the neighborhood. I went to see her once in Florence in 1972, Palumbo recalled. I was there for the Henry Moore retrospective and decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Palumbo was, among other things, very close to Mies van der Rohe. He owned two Mies houses, I'm not quite sure. He owned the famous Frank Lloyd Wright house, possibly a second Mies house. They were friends in any case. So before visiting Edith Farnsworth, who had this famous beef with Mies, Palumbo, I think this is from an interview I conducted with him. I quote, I apologized to Mies when I told him I was going to see her, and all he said was good luck. He never really said anything critical about her, although she started saying rather critical things about him. That stopped because I intervened a little bit, Palumbo speaking. It was clear that the damage had been done. I had dinner with her in her rather gloomy home overlooking Florence. It was a bit boring. She made me listen while we sat in these immensely high-backed and very uncomfortable chairs while she recited her translation of Montale endlessly. Very sorry. I can't imagine that would be boring in any sense. All I wanted, this is Palumbo speaking, all I wanted was to get back to Henry Moore and the Villa Belvedere, a very famous posh hotel, and report how the day had gone. I was being read to like a child. I was treated to the seminar on Montale, which I didn't fully understand. It was an interminable thing. Outwardly, I appeared interested and unperturbed. Edith was certainly a very clever person, although I have no idea how well she translated him into English. I was glad to get away, poor old thing. I think she was quite a remote person when she went there. Edith also entertained social register companions from Chicago. Her old friend Betsy Strauss was much more accommodating than Palumbo about poetry nights. Edith reported, quote, she listened devotedly to every evening of poetry, either original or translated from my Italian poets of the 20th century. Marquis Emmons visited Bagno and later recalled the villa's frescoed chapel and its extensive olive groves and vineyard. A butler named Vittorio served at meals, wearing white gloves. Quote, Edith really lived in style, Emmons later said. Emmons' daughter Susan also found her way to the Florentine foothills. Quote, I remember that beautiful villa Up on the hillside, she said it was terraced with olive trees, and she had a pet tortoise rambling around the garden. She had staff there. It was quite lovely. How happy Edith was is anyone's guess. In a letter to Pizzuto, she talked about, quote, my tired and depressed life. I dragged myself through the days, she wrote to Montale, and I abandoned myself with relief, even with joy at night, with the view of the dark hills and the sound of the owls. Her literary friends, such as Montale and Piero, popped in occasionally. She mentioned that Montale had visited to discuss her translation of his 1971 collection, Satura. It seemed to me he was happy, Edith reported, but I have the impression it will never be published in America. She was right. It would not be published in English in either of their lifetimes. She described Piero as, quote, a very strange writer from the remote district of Tursi. Piero wrote in an archaic Lucanian dialect, quote, a language outside the course of history, as suitable for speaking to the dead as to the living, according to the critic J.E. Everson. Edith wondered out loud, quote, whether a poet who chooses to write his tales or verses in Lucanian dialect cares very much about whether he comes to be read or not. Piero came to be read in Edith Farnsworth's translation in 1976. She published, quote, a beautiful story, a short collection of Piero's Lucanian poems with the Milan publishing house All'insegna del Pesco d'Ora. A friend named Felicita Audicio recalled Edith waiting, quote, for the translation of Piero's poems, and she invited me to Antella on the pretext of seeking comfort for her linguistic choices, but in fact for the pleasure to be together, to chat about her translations, to sip a martini, waiting for the sunset in the Italian garden of her villa. She really was an extraordinary woman. This is the same person whose account of Edith's death I'm going to end with right now. Edith Farnsworth died on December 4th, 1977, at her home, Villa Le Tavernule, outside of Florence. She was 74 years old. Gianfranco Contini left an account of her thinly attended funeral, which, quote, was organized by her doctor and neighbor, the gerontologist Francesco Antonini, who had ascertained her death and had had to certify it. Montale wrote to Contini, Edith's disappearance grieved me, but the fact is that we have seen each other very few times, and this deadens the pain. Maybe I am speaking nonsense, and I show hardness of heart, but at my age, nothing remains but to harden. In an interview sometime later, Contini described Edith as, quote, an American woman who unfortunately died some years ago, who was Montale's best translator, even if no one ever took note. The philologist, in declaring Farnsworth's name, specifies that she was, quote, a great doctor, that, quote, she nearly received a Nobel Prize for a clinical discovery, and that she then abandoned everything for poetry and Italy, retreating to a villa in Tuscany. Edith's brief obituary in the Chicago Tribune knew nothing of her poetry, her Italian translations, or her coterie of Florentine intellectuals. The Tribune noted her 27 years of service at Passavant Memorial Hospital and her former ownership of Mies van der Rohe's, quote, world-famous Farnsworth House near Plano, a white-painted steel and glass box resting on 8 supporting columns. Dr. Farnsworth's ashes will be returned to Chicago for interment, the paper reported. Edith's remains found their final resting place in Chicago's Graceland Cemetery, among other members of the extended Brooks family. Her full name was Edith Brooks Farnsworth. Just a few hundred feet away, there is a polished granite headstone marking the grave of Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, 1886 to 1969. Thanks for your attention.
on Farnsworth's life in Italy, and I'm sure Alex will answer your questions if there are.
This is more in the way of gossip, but if I'm not mistaken, Montale's wife died earlier than he, obviously, and many of the poems in the collection of Satura are written about his relationship to her. And it's fascinating that Farnsworth and he had a relationship, and she thought it was romantic. This must have been after the fact. Well, his poetry really changed in a certain way, from what I've read. I don't know those poems very well, but is there?
Well, I should make clear, I'm really not equipped to answer a question about Montale. I'll briefly respond to you. I sent a draft of this to this guy Galassi, who's currently Montale's translator, and I had actually written that. Where did he insert this correction? I wonder if I have it here. I had written that Montale was his wife had died and he had a mistress, and Galassi corrected me. At this stage in his, excuse me, here's what I originally wrote. I said a Farnsworth-Montale romance was probably not in the cards, given that the poet was already freighted down with the usual baggage of the successful mid-century intellectual, i.e. a wife and mistress. So that's completely true. Yeah, his wife had died. And then Galassi corrected me, saying Montale was living in Milan at the time Farnsworth knew him. His wife had died in 1963. No mistress either. At this point, his housekeeper, the famous Gina Tiossi, took care of him in his old age. That's really all I can tell you.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
And then that woman, the housekeeper, had been with the family for 30 years.
Apparently she's a huge figure, and I don't know anything about Satura except that it was,
I'm sorry. Yeah,
it was never published, that's all.
But thank you in any case, because Farnsworth is a fascinating woman.
She is.
How many have you all been to the Farnsworth House?
Oh, well, okay. It's a pretty cultured crowd.
No, this is another question. I've tried 3 times and been unable to get an appointment because you cannot always succeed in getting appointments there for some reason. It must be because of limited access.
I think it's actually now open in the winter. I think you'll have a lot more ease of access now.
Scott, you should stand up and be recognized.
This is Scott Mahaffey, the new executive director of the Farnsworth House, works for the National Trust.
We have Farnsworth staff here. Some of our guides are here this evening as well. And we are open Tuesdays and Saturdays, January through March, and then we resume our near daily tour schedule, Tuesdays through Sundays, in 1st of April, the 2nd of March.
They should, the guides at the Farnsworth should stand up.
Yes, yes, please do. Including 2 of our longest term guides.
I noticed, is the director of the Mies Society arrived? Does Cynthia stand up and be recognized as our one of our co-groupies, and she's at IIT and in the Mies Society.
Yes, I just would like to know why she sued him. Why did she sue Mies van der Rohe?
She didn't.
Good point.
Mies sued her for his fee and won the case.
Right. I will have a look.
There was a big dispute, but Mies sued her and won the case.
There's a big chapter in my book, obviously, about the dispute went to court. Mies was the moving party, urged on, of all things, by Robert Wiley, intimate friend of Philip Johnson. So Johnson played this strange role in this particular instance. And then there was a countersuit in them. I would not have written this book unless a group of people had unearthed the 4,000-page transcript of that Kendall County action, because it's genuinely fascinating. It's only really been out there. It figures largely in the revised biography of Mies by Windhorst and Schultz. And it figures even more largely in my book. Any other questions? Edith Farnsworth, this is your last chance. Yeah, go.
Do you see a parallel between her apparent affection for Mies and apparent affection for Montale?
Yes, and her apparent affection for Corti. I do. I do. I mean, to me, it's manifest. But I'm not, you know, that's all I can say. I mean, you know, she's a poet. She's a really intellectual person, the same way Mies was.
Well, would you comment then briefly on her career as a nephrologist? Because she was on the faculty at Northwestern, right?
Yes.
Women in medicine weren't on university faculties in the 40s and 50s. So it seems to me that she must have been not just good at the job, but really, really good. And you, at the end, you said, someone said she had done research that was worthy of a Nobel Prize. So this is a person who, in her own profession, ought to be, it sounds like, treated as a really impressive figure. On the other hand, she's patronized in relation to Mies. Your characterization of her relationship to Montale was slightly patronizing. The child being taken care of, or the young woman taken care of by her violin teacher, suggests a patronizing relationship, which is a kind of standard men taking advantage of women story that we're all familiar with. And I'm hoping that you're going to tell me I've got this all wrong, and you're going to really you know, bring forward.
I'm really known for my self-deprecating streak. Yeah.
For her career as a medical researcher. But I may be, you know, I know little bits.
In this book, which is not exclusively about Dr. Farnsworth, it's also about the house and about Mies. Her medical work is tremendously important. It's tremendously important to me. I mean, I had a, you know, the president of the Society of Nephrology read the brief, but I mean, you know, this is very sophisticated. Let me cut to the point that I know you want to make, and it's indeterminate. And I don't mean to be condescending to her Italian friends, but it's not like that amazing story of the woman who was cheated out of the Crick Watson Nobel. Okay, it's not that kind of a story. I'm certain. She clearly was an early researcher in the field of ACTH, a synthetic hormone used to treat Bright's disease, which is one of the cornerstone renal diseases. I'm going to know a lot more at the end of tomorrow, and what I find out at the end of tomorrow will be in my book. But I don't think that's the story. Believe me, my antennae are very much up for that. Okay. I think she's undercredited, although again, you know, if you use the Google research tool, she's a named contributor on at least 12 important articles. And I'm not a doctor, and in medical research, of course, it really matters if you're forward or first, right? And always a man's name is first. I mean, your generalizations happen to, of course, correct. And she struggled with some of the men who ran the hospitals where she worked. I don't quite know her. It's hard to answer questions about her research. She was clearly an adequately funded researcher for about 10 years, and then, you know, just ended. But then again, she left America, etc. She decided to change careers. Sorry to run on about that. It's interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Great.
Now we conclude with the second part of the reading. Cynthia and Larry.
One of the words in this poem is the prodigious which in this case refers to portentous signs. This is a poem about finding consolation in a world of suffering. Oft times have I met. Oft times have I met the grief of life. It was the choked source which gurgled, the shriveling of the scorching leaf upon the stalk. It was the bludgeoned horse. Goodness has been to me unknown, aside from the prodigious, which disclosed divine indifference. The man of stone amid the somnolence of noon, the cloud, and high above, the soaring hawk.
Spesso il male di vivere ho incontrato, era il rivo strozzato che gorgoglia, era l'incartocciarsi della foglia riarsa, era il cavallo stramazzato. Bene non seppi, fuori del prodigio che schiude la divina indifferenza, era la statua nella sonnolenza del meriggio, e la nuvola, e il falco, alto, levato.
On ways of recalling a dear friend, thinking of your smile. Thinking of your smile, it turns into a limpid pool, which by good luck I found among the river's rocks. A looking glass in which an ivy views her trailing locks, and over all the vault of quiet sky. This I recall, and far would I be from knowing if your face reveals an artless soul, or if you might be a wanderer who atones for the world's evil, wearing his suffering like a talisman. But this I will tell you. Your image evoked submerges life's griefs like a wave of calm, and your silhouette converges sharp upon my memory like the pinnacle of a young palm.
Ripenso il tuo sorriso, ed è per me un'acqua limpida, scorta per avventura tra le petraie d'un greto, esiguo specchio in cui guardi un'ellera ai suoi corimbi, e su tutto l'abbraccio d'un bianco cielo quieto. Codesto è il mio ricordo, non saprei dire, oh lontano, se dal tuo volto s'esprime libera un'anima ingenua, ovvero tu sei dei raminghi che il male del mondo estenua e recano il loro soffrire con sé come un talismano. Ma questo posso dirti, che la tua pensata effigie sommergi i crucci estrosi in un'ondata di calma, e che il tuo aspetto si insinua nella mia memoria grigia, schietto come la cima di una giovinetta palma.
The word windlass refers to a pulley, evoking remembrance of the past, but also the impossibility of returning to it. The windlass squeaks. The windlass squeaks within the ancient well. The water mounts to the light with which it blends. In the brimming pail, a recollection trembles. An image smiles within a liquid ring. I approach that face of evanescent lips. The past recoils, shatters, and grows old. It belongs now to another being. Revolving, the wheel squeaks again, returning to you, to the cold shaft. Oh, vision, soon removed, and now dissolving.
Cigola la carrucola. Cigola la carrucola del pozzo. L'acqua sale alla luce e vi si fonde. Trema un ricordo nel ricolmo secchio. Nel puro cerchio un'immagine ride. Accosto il volto ai evanescenti labbri. Si deforma il passato, si fa vecchio, appartiene ad un altro. Ah, che già stride la ruota, ti ridona all'atro fondo visione. Una distanza ci divide.
Thank you, Alberta, and we look forward to seeing you in our next iteration of the Poetry Foundation, and we'll make sure that we post this news on the website, and we sort of, for those of you who reserved for this evening, we'll make sure that we get all emails together and we send them to you.
Okay. So, thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed tonight's event, and I hope to see you again here at the Institute for other events or at the Poetry Foundation in May 14th. Or 19th.
May 14th.
14th. Thank you very much, and please stay with us for a glass of wine and a bite. Thank you.
È stato bello, vero? Ah, grazie, grazie mille.
direzione medica, insomma è stato un lavoro molto importante. Sì. Perfetto, grazie. Mi fa piacere, grazie. Grazie
How are you doing? Very good, very good. No, that our speaker from the East said something that I find unusual. In the days here in Chicago. So what does it make it now? Well, I have a brother-in-law who moved from Chicago to Boston. And he went to grad school to take art. Grew up in the and when he went to Boston, everybody was saying, where did you go to school? So I said, University of Chicago. Not quite knowing. And he's like, wait a minute, what's up with this? Their translation of the whole world is their currency is press, not necessarily how. He said, where did you press? So you're supposed to know that answer. Where did you press?
And so it's Yale or Harvard or nothing else.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because it's really sort of a when he's saying that, does that mean when there were writers?
Oh, this is quite a good turnout.
The University of Chicago people? Yeah, because certainly in the world of medicine and economics, I mean, the Nobel Prizes were like every year, right? I mean, I don't know. You know, the East Coast, like it's all kind of, it's very myopic, you know, it's like New York, Boston, and so when my father was traveling from St. Louis, where I grew up, was in New York, and somebody said, oh, do you know Charlie? Does Charlie live in St. Louis? It's in Cincinnati. Like, why would I know something? You know, like, their view of it's all up there, it's all in the cornfield.
I'm trying not to eat it because it's hard to. I had so much to eat last night at this party. I'm trying not to eat it. Yeah. Where was you sitting? Well, I didn't know. I ate way too much. Yeah. It was a mansion, a landmark, Chicago landmark.
You know, I think that they were they also like confusion. Somebody would say, it is this way. I mean, it's very, I think, I'm glad I But it's interesting. It's shocking how then again, the question of the day, you were talking and you moved to Odessa, Texas, and both of your families were and you moved to Odessa, Texas. I mean, the only place you could rent was where you were my daughter called up and said, Mom and Dad, I'm moving to Texas, and the only place I can live in is this brother. And I'm not going to say practice because I think that's an important point. When you say, well, I'm going to help you, you're on the mission sector where they access their first house. It's literally the first place. And while they moved from Connecticut, his father was a senator from Connecticut. Walker Point is that's actually making more money than this. I don't know. Makes it so punitive. You can't really right now. There's other people they don't go to California. So, I mean, you can't take that transition when you're selling your house here.
She's in Chicago, so she said she was going to come. We'll have to ask. She would have talked to Alex. So I think we're still recording, by the way. Yeah, we should probably do this up.